Hello and welcome to the Gremlins Garden. In today's episode, we'll be talking about succession sowing, heat retention methods, composting, and we'll be touching on biodynamic gardening a little bit as well. So succession sowing is exactly what it sounds like. It's sowing seeds in succession. So last week we sowed several rounds of seeds, and this week we would re-sow some of these seeds. The purpose of doing this is so that your crops mature at different times, so that you have less to deal with at once. So you're not trying to preserve, store, and eat all of your vegetables and fruits at once. You get several different harvest periods, and then it's easier for you to manage the amount. And hi, Katie. It's easier for you to manage the amount that you're working with, and less likely that your produce will rot while you're trying to get to it. Now, in the first video, I recommended that you try out 2 to 3 varieties to begin with and really become an expert on those varieties. Just now starting seeds, my recommendations for your 3 varieties that you would pick would be Swiss chard, because it's relatively cold hardy. It has a lot of ornamental interest in it, especially the very bright colorful varieties like the red and the pink. They have a very bright stalk, and then the veining on the leaves is also the same color, so it's really nice to look at, and it brings a lot of color into your garden. Also, they're higher in vitamins than most of the lettuces that you would use in your salads, so it really brings up the nutritional value of your salads and other meals that you add it to. It can be eaten fresh, it can be cooked, it can be used as a sandwich wrap instead of bread. It's really versatile. Another recommendation is kohlrabi. It happens to be one of my favorites. People call it a turnip apple because it sort of tastes like a cross and a texture between an apple and a turnip. I really like the texture. The taste is great. It's really juicy and amazing. It goes good in like dips, salads, everything. It's sort of actually a little bit similar to jicama, but it tastes more like a sort of broccoli. And the leaves are edible as well. Lastly, radishes are a great choice because they're very cold hardy and all of the plant is edible. The bulb, the leaves, the flowers, the immature seed pods, and the mature seeds are all edible. They can be used fresh, they can be used cooked. What's great about the radish is if you accidentally didn't harvest the bulbs when they were ready to go and they cracked and they started to rot in the field, you can still harvest the tops and eat them. Let's take a look at the seeds that we planted last week. Look at all these little babies coming up. Now you'll notice these guys here, these are what are called seed leaves, or if you want to get technical, Cotyledons. They are the first leaves that emerge as a plant comes up out of the soil, but they are not what are called the true leaves, or the first leaves. The purpose of these is merely to provide some photosynthesis and chlorophyll and nutrients to the plant so that it can begin really growing. And you'll notice that these are unique to the type of plant. For example, brassicas, such as cauliflower, broccoli, kale, those guys have these little heart-shaped seed leaves here like this. These are beets here. Here's some red beets. The leaves will be red. Here's the phacelia, and you can see its first true leaves are emerging on some of them already. Now, the reason why I say that you should choose open pollinated varieties if you're interested in seed saving is because hybrid varieties, which are either labeled hybrid on the package or they have an F1, those will not make the seeds, it will not make the same plant as the plant that you grew. The reason for this is genetics. If you have an open pollinated variety crossed with the same open pollinated variety, they make a seed that is true to the variety. So it looks exactly and tastes exactly like the parents. If you take two different open pollinated seeds, or two different hybrid seeds, or an open pollinated and a hybrid seed, and you cross them, you now have a different hybrid plant that has certain genetics from each of its parents and won't actually be entirely similar to either one. It has sort of its own thing going on. So this is actually how they hybridize seeds, and if you're interested in hybridizing seeds, this is how you should go about it. But if you're interested in having the exact variety that you had before, you want to choose an open pollinated variety and cross it with the exact same open pollinated variety. We'll talk more about how to successfully make sure that you're not cross-pollinating the wrong varieties later, but just for now, while you're picking your seed packets, you want to go with open pollinated. So a lot of the cold season crops that we're talking about, specifically the lettuces, radishes, gourmet greens, the vegetables that you're harvesting the leaves on particularly, and you're not trying to get them to flower and fruit, those guys are particularly susceptible to what is called bolting, which is flowering prematurely. So this often happens because of the weather, because of the temperature. So when it's excessively hot, a lot of these cold season crops like lettuce and Swiss chard and radish, it stimulates them to make flowers. These crops are what are known as an annual, which means that they germinate, grow, go to seed, and die all in 1 year. And the time at which they do these things is stimulated by the weather and how the weather is changing. So when it starts to get hotter, it tells these plants it's time to hurry up and make your seeds before the heat kills you. And if the heat kills them before they have a chance to make their seeds, then they were unsuccessful and they didn't pass on their genetics. So it's in their best interest to flower when it's hot. For this reason, it can be sort of tricky this time of year, in the end of August, when it's still really hot during the day and not too cold at night yet. It can encourage these plants to bolt. So the way that you cut down on the chances that these plants will bolt is by putting them in part shade. Full sun is considered a minimum of 6 hours a day. It's preferable to have them exposed to morning sun and to be shaded by the afternoon, because the afternoon sun is a lot more intense and hot, and it can actually lead to burning and bolting. So the ideal place in your garden for these plants that might bolt quickly is on the northeastern side. Now the reason for this is because in the Northern Hemisphere, at this time of year, we're beginning to tilt away from the sun. So if you imagine that this lemon is the sun, and this little blueberry is the earth. I know it's not proportional, but let's just go with it. So the Northern Hemisphere, that's us up here on the top. As we go into winter, the earth is tilting on its axis so that the Northern Hemisphere is pointing away from the sun as it rotates. This means that we have less light, and the sun appears to make a lower arc through the sky throughout the day. So it rises in the east, makes a southern arc through the sky, and sets in the west. That's the reason why you want to plant your plants on the northeastern side, is because it gets morning sun, and by the afternoon it's in the shade. So keeping this in mind, you want to plant your tallest plants at the back of the garden on the northern side, and your shorter plants at the front of the garden, with the exception that the ones that you're trying to protect from afternoon sun, you plant in the shade of other plants. You can do this by planting crops that are fine being in full sun, and then planting the susceptible crops underneath them or behind them so that they get shade. Now, a note about spacing. You want your plants spaced just far enough apart that their leaves are barely touching or have a few inches of space between them, depending on how much space you have in your garden and how close you're planting. You don't want leaves to be heavily overlapping each other, especially of different plants. It makes it easier for insects to walk or slither from leaf to leaf and cause more damage, and it also creates a microclimate for fungal and bacterial activity, especially when it rains and the leaves stick to each other like this. In between the leaves is very likely to get a fungal disease. You can extend your season even longer by using heat retention barriers. These come in the form of miniature greenhouses, cold frames, cloches, and mulch. These can also be fashioned out of makeshift stuff that you find around the home or for free on Craigslist, rather than going out and buying something professionally made, and they work just as well. For example, for a cloche, you can cut off the bottom of a 1-gallon milk container, stick it over the plant, and poke air holes in the top. For a cold frame, you can get windows for free off Craigslist and put them into a box, or you can use hay as the surrounding and just put the one window on the top. On hot days, you do want to open up the cold frame and remove the cloche so that you don't burn your plants or force them to bolt. Mulches sit on top of the soil. They help reduce evaporation caused by heat, and they help keep heat in the soil. They come in the form of wood chips, dead leaves, other types of organic matter, and compost. They also provide food for worms and microbes living in the soil and improve your soil structure over time as they break down. And it can help reduce the compaction caused by rainfall, so that your roots have a nice loose soil to grow through. And also all of the increased worm and microbial activity helps with the reduced soil compaction as well. You can also use things like straw or cover crops, also known as green manure. Those are like fava beans, oat grass, rye, other types of cover crops you can find easily on most vendors' websites, and they have them in pre-packaged, like specific to what you need to do with your soil. Like if you want to up the nitrogen content, you can get Austrian field peas. You let them grow, and before they flower, you chop them down into the soil. Or if the frost kills them off, then you don't have to chop them down into the soil. They sort of break down in place, and they improve the soil over time, especially the nutrient content of the soil, which makes your plants more nutrient dense when you harvest them. A quick note, if you have the option, you want to try to get these wood chips. If you're going to do wood chips as a mulch, you want to try to get them from an organic company that works in organic yards if possible, to avoid adding pesticides to your garden. The best type of material is deciduous trees that have some of their greenery chipped in with them. Now is also a really good time to be prepping your beds for next year and composting in place. If you have your own composting system that's either a hot pile or a cold pile already removed from the garden, that's great, but you can also compost in place by using green manures, adding dead leaves, grass clippings, all of that, and sort of putting your garden to bed for the winter. Especially if you're not going to be doing fall crops, it's a really great idea to compost in place so that in the fall you have really, really great soil that's ready to go. Also, you notice that compost attracts a lot of worms. I personally never buy worm castings because I have so many worms naturally in my garden because of the compost. And if you just turn up the compost pile, there's hundreds of worms in there, and so I personally don't spend my money on worm castings. The health of your plants is a reflection of the health of your soil. You need to feed your soil, make it healthy, increase the amount of microbial and worm activity in it, and your plants will be healthier, and you'll notice the difference. Especially since when you're growing plants, especially fruiting plants, in an area consistently, you tend to draw a lot of nutrients out of the soil. And by adding compost, it's sort of a slow breakdown that re-energizes the soil, feeds the microbes. If the soil is healthy and thriving with microbial life, then your plants are going to be much happier and you're going to notice the difference. Especially since microbes form a symbiotic relationship with plants, they help bring nutrients and water to the roots, and in turn the roots give off what's called exudates that the microbes can use for food. Also, healthy plants are much more resistant to pests, and you'll notice that you have less of an issue. If you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants. Now, the reason for planting inedible flowers in your garden is because it attracts pollinators. It's something that is called biodynamic gardening. It's when you try to mimic nature, have a closed ecosystem where pests, predators, and pollinators all exist together and keep each other in check. It's also a lot of fun to just sit in the garden and watch all of the pollinators moving around. There's just so much activity, and it's especially fun for kids, and they can learn a lot. Even in the wintertime, you'll have birds attracted that eat the flower seeds that have fallen on the ground. They especially like rudbeckia seeds, echinacea seeds, sunflower seeds. They love those, and it's really fun to watch them sort of, picking around in the ground. You can also create habitat for them by planting certain perennials like gooseberries. Birds love to live in gooseberry trees.